In this video, we'll review Chapter 38, and we'll start with Kennedy's New Frontier, and then move into LBJ's Great Society. John F. Kennedy pledged to get the country moving again. He personified glamour and the vitality of his administration. He was the youngest president ever elected, and he had assembled one of the youngest cabinets, including his 35-year-old brother, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General. He tried to recast the priorities of the FBI away from internal security and towards organized crime and the civil rights enforcement. His efforts were resisted by J. Edgar Hoover, who had served as FBI director longer than the new Attorney General had lived. The inner circle of confident and sophisticated advisors were most important. Robert McNamara left the presidency of Ford Motor Company to head the Defense Department under Kennedy. And Kennedy inspired high expectations. The New Frontier depicted America's potential for greatness. The Peace Corps was an army of mostly youthful volunteers to bring American skills to underdeveloped countries. They summoned citizens to serve their country, and their soaring rhetoric was not matched any other political situation. Congress was made of Republicans and Southern Democrats who teamed up to oppose the New Frontier proposals. JFK won the first round when he forced Congress to expand the House Rules Committee, which had been dominated by conservatives. Still, the New Frontier did not expand swiftly. Key medical and education bills were stalled in Congress, and Congress rejected JFK's plan to cut taxes as economic boost. JFK had a complex relationship with big business. He helped negotiate and enforce a non-inflationary wage agreement in the steel industry in 1962. The New Frontier was extended to be the final frontier, and this promoted a multi-billion-dollar project to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The moon shot a calculated plan to restore America's prestige in the space race, which had been severely damaged by the Soviet Sputnik successes. $24 billion later, 2 NASA astronauts planted their footprints and the U.S. flag on the moon's surface in 1969. The Apollo mission would be seen live on television around the globe, and this became a symbol of U.S. dominance. This is a picture of the moon's eye view of Earth that greeted the men who landed on the lunar surface. This is astronaut Buzz Aldrin descending from the spacecraft. Kennedy and Khrushchev first met in Vienna in June 1961. East Germany had began to build the Berlin Wall in August of 1961, which was designed to plug the heavy population drain from the East Germany to West German areas. This stood for almost 3 decades as a symbol of post-World War II division of Europe into 2 hostile camps. This is a picture of the Berlin Wall, which stood from 1961 to 1989, separating East and West Berlin. Demonstrators began to tear down the wall in 1989 following powerful nonviolent protests in East Germany. The European Economic Community was created, and this was a free trade area that later evolved into the European Union. JFK secured the passage of the Trade Expansion Act in 1962. This authorized tariff cuts for up to 50% to promote trade with the EEC countries, and this led to the so-called Kennedy round of tariff negotiations, which concluded in 1967. This was globalization, a new era of robustly reinvigorated international commerce. The growing decolonization of European overseas possessions was also creating problems for U.S. policy. The danger of the Cold War competition there was escalating into nuclear confrontation between the USA and the USSR. JFK had moved from Ike's doctrine of massive retaliation to McNamara's strategy of flexible response. They developed an array of military options that could be matched to the gravity of the crisis at hand, and Kennedy increased spending on conventional military forces and bolstered special forces, such as the Green Berets. The doctrine of flexible response potentially lowered the level at which diplomacy would give way to shooting. It provided a mechanism for progressive and possibly endless stepping up use of force. South Vietnam presented the proof of these pitfalls. The corrupt right-wing government of Ngo Dien Diem in Saigon ruled shakily since the 1954 partition. In 1961, Kennedy ordered a sharp increase in the number of military advisors, as they were called, which were actually U.S. troops, into South Vietnam. The U.S. forces entered South Vietnam to foster political stability, but by protecting Diem from communists. But they were frustrated with Diem's refusal to reform, and JFK's administration encouraged a coup against Diem in November of 1963. JFK told the South Vietnamese that it was their war, but he made dangerously deep political commitments there and ordered more than 15,000 Americans into the Asian slaughter pen. A graceful pullout was becoming increasingly more difficult. This is a map of Vietnam and Southeast Asia and the engagements from 1954 to 1975. Kennedy also had confrontations in Latin America. The Alliance for Progress in 1961 had been hailed as the Marshall Plan for Latin America and was intended to quiet communist agitation there. But the results were very disappointing. There was very little alliance, less progress, and the U.S. handouts had little positive impact on Latin America's immense social problems. These problems were inherited from Eisenhower's administration, as a CIA-backed scheme to topple Fidel Castro was already underway. By invading Cuba with anti-communist exiles in April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place and failed. The events pushed Castro closer to the USSR. So in October of 1962, the U.S. spy plane revealed that the Soviets secretly were installing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. Kennedy and Khrushchev began a nerve-wracking game of nuclear chicken. On October 22, 1962, JFK ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba and demanded immediate removal of these missiles. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion basically was the impetus for heightened tensions between the USSR and the United States and Cuban leader Fidel Castro. JFK further warned that any attack on the USA from Cuba would trigger nuclear retaliation against the Soviet Union. The world teetered on the brink of global atomization. On October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to a partial compromise. He said that he would remove missiles from Cuba, and the USA agreed to end the quarantine and to not invade Cuba. The USA agreed to remove from Turkey some of its missiles that were targeted at the Soviet Union. The fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis was this. Khrushchev was ultimately hounded out of office. The Soviet Union launched a major program of military expansion, and Kennedy pushed harder for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This pact would prohibit trial nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, and it was signed in 1963. The Moscow-Washington Hotline was created in 1963 as well, which permitted immediate teletype communication between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was another sign of the thaw in the Cold War. The most significant was Kennedy's speech at American University in June of 1963. He urged Americans to abandon their view of the Soviet Union as a devil-ridden land filled with fanatics, to deal with the world as it is, not as it might have been had the history of the last 18 years been different. He tried to lay a foundation for a policy of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, and this is the modern origins of a policy known as détente, which is French for relaxation of tension. There was also a struggle for civil rights going on during JFK's administration. He had appealed to black voters in 1960, but he moved slowly on civil rights issues because he needed support of the Southerners in Congress for the New Frontier programs. The Freedom Riders fanned out to end segregation in facilities serving interstate bus passengers during this time period. The white mob torched the Freedom Ride bus near Anniston, Alabama in May of 1961. Attorney General Robert Kennedy's representative was beaten unconscious in the anti-Freedom Ride riot in Montgomery. And when local governments wouldn't stop the violence, Washington dispatched federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. This is a picture of the Freedom Ride in 1961 near Anniston, Alabama, where the bus was burned that was carrying an interracial group of Freedom Riders. The Kennedy administration reluctantly joined hands with the civil rights movement, and Kennedy was ultra wary about the political associates of Martin Luther King Jr. Some thought King's advisors had communist links, but Robert Kennedy ordered the FBI to wiretap King's phone in 1963, and the relationship between King and the Kennedys was overall a fruitful one. The Voter Education Project was inaugurated to register the South's historically disenfranchised blacks. The integration of Southern universities were done in some cases painlessly, but the University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss as it's come to be known, became a volcano. Veteran James Meredith encountered violent opposition when he attempted to register there in October of 1962, and Kennedy was forced to send in 400 federal marshals and 3,000 troops to enroll Meredith in his first class. In the spring of 1963, King launched his campaign against discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama. This was the most segregated big city in America. Since 1957, attempts to crack racial barriers there had produced more than 50 cross burnings and 18 bomb attacks. The violence occurred as police used attack dogs and high-pressure hoses on demonstrators, which was all shown on TV. This caused Kennedy to deliver a televised speech to the nation on June 11, 1963. He called the situation a moral issue and committed his personal and presidential prestige to finding a solution. He declared the principle at stake is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. He called for a new civil rights legislation to protect black citizens. This is a picture of the demonstrators being hosed down during their demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. The March on Washington took place in August of 1963, where Martin Luther King led more than 200,000 participants on a peaceful march. In an electrifying speech at the Lincoln Memorial, King declared, "I have a dream," but still violence continued. On the night of Kennedy's television address, white gunmen murdered Medgar Evers, who was a black Mississippi civil rights worker. And in September of 1963, an explosion blasted a Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 black girls. Kennedy's civil rights bill was stalled in Congress during this time period. This is a picture of Martin Luther King in the March on Washington addressing the crowd with his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy visited Dallas, Texas, and he was shot and died within seconds. The VP, Johnson, was sworn in as president. The alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was killed in front of TV cameras by a self-appointed avenger, Jack Ruby. An elaborate investigation by Chief Justice Warren could not quiet the doubts and theories about what really happened, and still to this day, there are many theories about how Kennedy, or who actually killed Kennedy. Kennedy had been in the White House for slightly more than 1,000 days, but he was acclaimed more for his ideals and the spirit he kindled than for the concrete goals that he had achieved. And basically, he became a martyr after his assassination. He was an inspirational figure for the rising baby boom generation of the 1960s. And now we'll talk about, in part 2, LBJ's Great Society. Lyndon Baines Johnson became president upon the assassination of Kennedy, and he was sent to Congress in 1937 at the age of 29. FDR was his political daddy, Johnson claimed, and LBJ strongly supported New Deal measures. When he lost a bid for Senate in 1941, he learned that liberal politics did not win elections in Texas. So he won a Senate seat in 1948 by shifting his policies to the right and by a questionable 87 vote margin, hence the nickname Landslide Lyndon. In the Senate, Johnson developed into a master wheeler and dealer. He became the Democratic Majority Leader in 1954, and he used what was called the Johnson treatment, intimidating display of backslapping, flesh-pressing, and arm-twisting that overbore friends and foes alike. His ego and vanity were legendary, and as president, he shredded the conservative coloration of his Senate years to reveal the latent liberal that was actually underneath. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in his presidency. This banned racial discrimination in the most private facilities open to the public, including theaters, hospitals, and restaurants. It strengthened the federal government's power to end segregation in schools and public places. And Title VII barred employers from discriminating on race or national origin in hiring. This empowered the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, to enforce the law. Title VII, was passed with the gender clause intact, which proved to be a powerful instrument of federally enforced gender equality. Johnson, in 1965, issued the executive order requiring all federal contractors to take an affirmation action against discrimination. Johnson also pushed through Congress Kennedy's stalled tax bill and the proposals for the billion-dollar war on poverty. Concerns about poverty were raised by Michael Harrington's The Other America in 1962, which revealed that 20% of the population and over 40% of the black population were suffering in poverty. The war on poverty was part of LBJ's Great Society, which was a sweeping New Deal-style domestic reform movement. It targeted the remaining pockets of poverty and made major new investments in the education and arts sectors. In the election of 1964, Johnson battled Goldwater for the presidency. Johnson's nomination was a foregone conclusion, and he was chosen by acclamation in Atlantic City. The Democrats stood foursquare on most liberal platforms since Truman's Fair Deal days. The Republicans met in San Francisco and nominated Senator Barry Goldwater, who was a conservative, and the stage was set for a historic clash of political principles. Goldwater's forces trounced the moderate Eastern establishment. He attacked the federal income tax, the Social Security system, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. He attacked civil rights legislation and the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and most loudly, LBJ's Great Society. His nomination reflected a growing conservative movement in the United States, which gathered strength in the mushrooming middle-class suburbs of the Sun Belt. This was led by William Buckley and Young Americans for Freedom, and it was well received by white Southerners who were angry at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Democrats' attack on Goldwater exploited the image of Goldwater as a trigger-happy cowboy. Negative campaigning was used during this time period, and this is the infamous attack ad that was televised only once as a paid political advertisement, but signaled the emergence of a newly noxious style of political campaign. Johnson's image as a resolute statesman continued. He seized upon the Tonkin Gulf episode in August of 1964. This covert United States help to South Vietnamese raids on northern Vietnam is what the Gulf of Tonkin was. LBJ publicly called the alleged attacks unprovoked and ordered limited retaliatory airstrikes. He claimed that he sought no wider war, and he got Congress to pass an all-purpose Tonkin Gulf resolution. Congress abdicated the war-declaring powers and handed the president a blank check to use further force in Southeast Asia. The election results in 1964 was that the voters flocked to Johnson because of their fondness for the Kennedy legacy, their faith in the Great Society promises, and their fear of Goldwater. So he clearly won the popular vote and the electoral count, 486 to 52. This is a map showing the presidential election of 1964 by candidate with the electoral vote and the popular vote. Goldwater carried only his native Arizona and 5 states in the South, but the South traditionally was Democratic, but now was racially restless. Johnson had a record-breaking 61% of the popular vote, which swept the lopsided Democratic majorities into both houses of Congress. The Great Society Congress began at this time. Johnson's win temporarily smashed the conservative congressional coalition of Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans. The road was open for the Great Society reforms, and LBJ helped by growing the economy. In the war on poverty, they doubled the appropriation of the Office of Economic Opportunity to $2 billion and granted more than $1 billion to redevelop Appalachia. They created 2 new departments, the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They also named the first black cabinet secretary in the nation's history, the respected economist Robert Weaver, to lead HUD. They established the National Endowments for the Arts and for the Humanities, which was designed to lift the level of American cultural life. The Big 4 legislative achievements that crowned LBJ's Great Society programs were, number 1, aid to education. This was to avoid the separation of church and state issue. LBJ awarded aid directly to students, and he signed the bill in a humble one-room Texas schoolhouse that he had attended as a child. The next was Medicare for elderly and Medicaid for the poor. This created entitlements, which were rights for certain categories of Americans in perpetuity, without the need for repeated congressional approval. This was part of spreading the rights revolution that helped millions, but he also created long-term financial problems for the federal government. The next was immigration reform. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the national origins quota system that hadn't been in place since 1921. He doubled the number of immigrants allowed to enter annually to 290,000, and for the first time set limits on immigrants from the Western Hemisphere to 120,000. He provided for the admission of close relatives of U.S. citizens outside the numerical limits. 100,000 people per year took advantage of the family unification provision in the decades after 1965, and this was the source of immigration that shifted from Europe to Latin America and Asia. The Great Society programs came in for political attacks in later years. Conservatives charged billions were spent for social engineering and that they were wasted, yet the poverty level declined in the ensuing decade. This is a woman shown giving thanks to President Lyndon Johnson for signing the Medicare bill in April 1965. Medicare dramatically reduced poverty among the elderly, and Project Head Start sharply improved educational performances of underprivileged youth. The Great Society programs reduced the infant mortality rates in minority communities. And this figure shows poverty in the United States from 1960 to 2012. So showing, following the 2000, the poverty rate fell to 11.3%, which was its lowest level since 1979. In the Great Recession of the early 21st century, it ticked upward again to 15% in 2012.